And joining us now for more from New York is Professor Alan Dershowitz, Professor Emeritus at Harvard Law School. And Professor Dershowitz, we've talked about these reforms in theory in the past, but now it's an actuality. Governments proposed them, judicial override with just that one-seat majority in the parliament, the Knesset. Your reaction?
Well, I think people are making a mistake by saying it makes Israel less democratic. In one sense, it makes Israel more democratic, that is, more subject to the will of the majority in the Knesset. But it makes Israel less subject to the rule of law, less subject to civil liberties, and less subject to minority rights. On balance, it's a very, very bad thing for Israel. But it is not diminishing Israel's democracy. It's eliminating a check on democracy. If these were to be passed, I would strongly oppose it, but it's not going to turn Israel into a tyranny or an authoritarian state. Both sides are exaggerating, I think, the impact of this legislation. It's not good legislation. It will hurt Israel in the international community, into the International Criminal Court, but it will not turn Israel into a tyranny. And I think both sides ought to take a deep breath and understand that this is something that many countries are going through today. The United States is going through the same debate, except in the United States, it's the left that wants to weaken the Supreme Court because they're not satisfied with some of their decisions. And in Israel, it's the right.
All right, but maybe let's sharpen then in that case. There are those who would say, okay, even if it causes Israel problems, perhaps in the diplomatic arena, it does, as you say, make the courts more democratic. That is certainly the argument Yariv Levin says. So why not do it? Maybe why would you oppose this change?
Because courts are not supposed to be democratic. Historically, courts are never supposed to be democratic. They're supposed to be checks on the excesses of democracy, which is why it's so important not to allow the Knesset, by one vote, to undo important decisions about equality, about justice, about dignity, about basic rights. If you're going to have an override, it should require bipartisan support, say 2/3 of the Knesset, or you might limit override only to political decisions like the dairy decision or like whether or not the gas deal with Lebanon was proper or improper. But when it comes to basic fundamental rights, equality based on gender, based on sexual orientation, based on ethnicity, those issues ought not to be subject to democratic Knesset decision. They ought to be made by courts under the rule of law as a check on democracy.
Well, there's let me just bring up two aspects here, which is Israel does not have an actual constitution. It does have basic laws. Those who propose these reforms say there are gaps there, and the court, an activist Supreme Court in Israel, take advantage of these gaps. And some of the other issues you raise, equality for rights, for example, are very subjective criteria.
Well, that's why exactly Israel needs a strong Supreme Court, precisely because it doesn't have a written constitution. And that's why the court itself has to serve as a check and balance on the excesses of temporary democracies. Courts are supposed to slow down democracies which are violating the rights of minorities. And that's what we're seeing happen today. You're seeing this coalition trying to trample on minority rights. And the Supreme Court is a check on that, a way of saying, wait a minute, the rule of law is not subject to a vote of 61. It's subject to enduring principles, basic rules. Israel does have a constitution like England does. It's not a written constitution, but it's based on tradition and basic laws. And the Supreme Court is a necessary check on the excesses of democracy. Be careful what you wish for, because today the right wing wants to weaken the Supreme Court. Tomorrow it might be the left wing, like in the United States. Tomorrow the Supreme Court may come to the assistance of the right. So these are temporary, politically motivated, partisan efforts to weaken an institution that has served the state of Israel very well, both domestically and internationally. It's not broken.
Well, let's briefly let's talk about internationally, Professor Dershowitz, especially on a day when we know, for example, the UN Security Council is meeting and possibly will be criticizing Israel in the course of its actions. What role does the court play there?
Well, the court sends a message to the international community that it requires compliance with the rule of law. It doesn't need outside influence. It doesn't need an international criminal court. It doesn't need an international court of justice. The Supreme Court of Israel does the job. It holds the Israeli Knesset and the majority to basic principles of justice. It does not need external interference. Give you an example. There were proposals to have different rules of engagement, shooting live ammunition at people depending on whether they're Arab or Jewish. No international court would ever uphold that, and the Israeli court would never uphold that. That's a clear violation of basic concepts of equality, even if a majority were to foolishly, and I don't think the Israeli majority would do that, but even if they were to foolishly vote for different rules of engagement based on race and ethnicity, that would be a terrible thing. And the Israeli Supreme Court would serve as a check on the excesses of a temporary majority based on a temporarily formed coalition. Enduring values are what comes from courts rather than from the Knesset. So to strike an appropriate balance requires a strong Supreme Court, particularly on basic issues of equality, due process, free speech, and fundamental liberty.